Hi, I'm Charles Galda. Welcome to the Church in Action podcast, where we talk about issues of God and culture to accelerate our ability to make disciples, to do justice, share Jesus, and transform New England. We believe when the people of God are doing the work of God in unity, it's evangelistic, and then people want to know our Jesus. That's why Jesus tells us, go make disciples. People are willing to disadvantage themselves to live in unity, speak truth, love and serve, fix our communities in the world, and get that opportunity to share Jesus with people. Today, I've got a special recurring contributing editor. I forget what we're going to have to call you because it's not just a guest, Enoch, because you've been back too many times for that. But I got a special guest. Reverend Enoch Liao is a pastor at Boston Chinese Evangelical Church. He's been, if you're a regular listener, you know Enoch by now. He's been here multiple times, always talking about difficult topics. And so we appreciate his grace in being willing to engage in some pretty difficult topics with us. We also normally have Dr. Hammond with us. He's on a well-deserved vacation this week, so we're going to talk about a slightly different topic today. That was one that was just Enoch and I could talk about. But Enoch, before we jump into the topic, could you just share a little bit about your story so folks know where are you from, where'd you grow up, how'd you come to Boston, those kinds of things?
Great. It's good to be here, Charles. And thanks for having me. And thank you on behalf of all of us to give us vacations like Ray getting a vacation. We appreciate that once every couple of years. No, it's good to be here. A little bit about myself. My ancestors are from China. My parents were born in China and then educated and raised in Taiwan. So, what people who know that sort of recent modern history know that they had to flee due to the Communist Revolution. And when they landed in Taiwan, they were in a latter wave of people coming. So they actually they fled uh, political persecution and then landed, and there was probably some tensions between the ethnic Chinese that came a wave earlier and the ethnic Chinese that had arrived post the Communist Party takeover in China. What that meant was that there's some tension, among other things. And then eventually they would come to the United States for their postgraduate and doctoral work, where they would have their kids. And we were I was born in the Midwest and grew up in Los Angeles. Got to study at UCLA, where I met my wife now, Karen. I went to Talbot Theological School of Theology at Biola University for seminary. And then in 2001, my wife and I moved here, just newly married for about a year, to serve at the church I'm at now, which is Boston Chinese Evangelical Church. And I've been there ever since. And they have not figured out a way to get rid of me yet. Though they probably, well, anyway. So yeah, so been there, served in different capacities in the church, and today I have the privilege of working with, overseeing the English ministries on both our campuses, for our Newton campus in the suburbs of Metro Boston, as well as our downtown Chinatown South End campus, our original campus. Yep.
So you've got multiple physical campuses, but then you've also got kind of different congregations by language too. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Pre-pandemic, because the pandemic changes a lot of things, we would have said we're one church with two campuses and seven congregations or services and three languages. Coming out of the pandemic, we're actually launching our public services this Sunday. So it's a little bit wild and crazy, but also very long awaited and hopeful to be able to worship with people. We had a soft launch last week with just a few folks to help us figure out how to do what is it like to usher someone to their seats again and play with music with people in the room. So actually, we will have a combined Cantonese service on Chinatown. So basically, each campus has Cantonese, English, and Mandarin services. But this is the first time in actually our church's history we'll have an afternoon English service in our downtown campus. So there's no worship team. It's just me. So that will not be live streamed for posterity's sake. Our original service at 9:15 will be. So that's our church. So it's multicultural, multi-generational, multilingual, multi-socioeconomic, multi-political. We've got lots of different views about China, Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the United States. And, you know, Republicans, Democrats, those sorts of things, even though it is largely predominantly one ethnicity. And we've talked about this, the difference between what people conflate as multi-ethnicity with multiculturalism. So I would say we're probably one of the most diverse churches around, though the evangelical subculture kind of sees us all as the same. It would be like an African church or an Arabic church where, yeah, maybe the broader white evangelical subculture sees they're all Arabs, but they're totally different from different cultures and even subgroups. So that's our
Yeah.
church.
I remember you saying one time to me that it wasn't until I forget at what point in your life that you realized you were Asian because you didn't consider yourself Asian before that because you were Chinese American.
Oh, I see. I think I was telling you a story regarding some of the violence and
Mhm.
how Asian, the term Asian American, I believe, has its roots in some of the political movements, most notably in UC Berkeley and UCLA in the 60s when Asian American activists tried to do. I think that's where the historic phrase for those
Mhm.
in our activists and organizers in our audience, so yellow peril supports black power. The idea that people were afraid of Asians and stuff. But the point is, it's a political bloc. Now it's a very warm Christian term. Many parachurches and churches and ministries call it Asian American ministries. It's very warm, fuzzy, and familiar. But when I was growing up, I think what you might be referring to is if something like a crime happened down the street to a Japanese family or a Korean family, my parents would not have necessarily seen that as an affront to them. They would have said, well, they're totally different. That's Vietnamese or Japanese. Not necessarily in a racist way, but because that's just different, right?
Yeah.
But today, in our cultural milieu here in the U.S., obviously it's a little different. So, but it's funny because growing up, I was definitely Chinese. I was Asian, but I didn't need to have that term. It wasn't Asian over and against, say, white majority culture. I was just Chinese American.
Yeah, I guess it's the analogy would be that most of my family comes from Ireland. I've got half my family's Middle European part, so I wouldn't necessarily have associated if somebody who was attacked was French,
Mm,
right? I wouldn't feel any, I wouldn't feel good about it or anything, but just because it's
right,
Europe, it wouldn't have necessarily meant anything special to me. Is that the
right.
same kind of concept?
I would say so, but because the United States scholars use the term is racialized, we do think in terms of race. I do think people today, well, actually, long racial studies would probably argue this. There definitely has been, whether it's a construct or a real, it's a big debate, but there is a whiteness. And I think today, if there was a crime against a white person, there might be that. Just like I do think today, a crime against an Asian American, Pacific Islander, or Desi American, which is sort of the Indian subcontinent, I do think people today, especially younger people growing up in our school systems, would actually take that as an attack and assault on themselves. So that's just the times we seem to be moving in and living in.
Yeah, once we kind of, I don't know if this is a fair way to say it, but kind of lumped all Asians together as Asian Americans, and now people tend to treat you less as a Chinese American and more like an Asian American, right? And specifically when there's violence targeted at Asian Americans, it's hard now to separate out. But I'm a Chinese American from a Japanese American because the attack is coming at anybody who's Asian. It would seem.
Um, that that's complicated. Just like I think we kind of know that if some African person or African American is speaking, we don't speak for the entire, population of that, ethnic background. I think the answers are very few and far between. I think the difference is there are very few platformed Asian American or APIDI. So AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander, APIDI, Asian Pacific Islander Desi American, APIDA. Oh no, I'm on public, and I forget the acronym. There's so many acronyms, but
But there's
basically,
two
yeah,
Asian American interest groups.
right, right. No, that's just ways to try to be inclusive. It's sort of like
Got,
BIPOC, BIPOC, Black,
got
Indigenous People of Color. So there are more inclusive phrases. AAPI happened to be one of the earlier ones, but the other thing with that is people don't necessarily assume Indians are Asian American. I think there probably is a presumption of East Asian as
yeah.
opposed to South Asian or Southeast Asian. So even that, I would say it's sort of like when I talk to my friends who happen to be from North Africa, like the country of Somali, uh, they're obviously black, they know that too, but I think their experience in terms of colonialism and how their countries have interacted with European cultures coming here, I think their experience is a little different. And I think, well, the few that have told me have really tried to highlight that. So it's challenging. We got to categorize people some way, but I
Yeah.
guess we just always got to remember to not, yeah, we can't be reductionistic.
Yeah, the fact that we don't consider people from India to be Asian is a reflection of us not teaching geography in the American school system anymore.
Yeah, that's a good can. Well, to be fair though, it's also probably a function of how we think race and culture. For example, they'll talk about churches like my church, which happens to be a Chinese heritage church, as opposed to a Swedish heritage or Irish heritage church, and they'll go, "Oh, someone used to go to my church, but oh, now they go to an American church." That is not a geographic issue. That is a cultural issue where, and you and I have talked about this, depending on the person, when they say, oh, they don't go to a Chinese heritage church anymore, or what they'll just call a Chinese church, which is also inaccurate because we have a lot of non-Chinese, at least enough to feel like I'm not Chinese, and they go to American church, if I'm comfortable or I know the person or if I think they won't take it the wrong way, I'll say, by American church, do you mean a white majority culture church? I mean, I'm just because my church has probably 1,000 American citizens who are voting. So I'm not sure what you mean by American church. Like, so, oh yeah, of course, of course. But see, again, that's, or hey, Charles is an American name. Someone like Ying or Wong is an ethnic name.
Mm.
And again, I think first of all, Charles isn't probably American. I think he's a little older than that. But I think it's again what people.
It might be derived from French, but please don't tell anybody
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah, it might be. Yeah, yeah, it might be a couple of royal families. But I think the key thing there is that's not. I don't. Some people call that a microaggression. Some people call that racism. Some people. I think it's just people haven't extended their categories enough to do those things. So when people don't think of India as in Asia, actually I think it's probably might be geography. I bet there's some of us that probably couldn't find India on the continent of Asia, but I think it's probably because of the racialized categories.
Mhm.
And again, I'm not railing against those categories. I do think they're potentially worth considering and reevaluating and in some ways problematic. But yeah, so we're getting into all sorts of stuff here, and I don't even know if we've introduced the topic yet. But this is
Well, hey, that's right. We're kind of knee deep in it, and we're already talking about it. It's an interesting point you make though about American churches, because I don't know of any churches that I think you mean when folks are saying American churches that would call themselves an American church.
no, these are Anglos
No, I
from
understand, but I don't
oh
think
yeah, oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
that
yeah,
they would say, "Hey, we're an American church. Come
yeah,
to
yeah.
us,"
They
right?
wouldn't say that unless they're
No.
looking at Asians, and that's the thing where again, where they would say it's a black church or that's an African American church, but they would say that's an Asian church, a Latino church, and they would conflate if they say African American church, then they'll like, well, we're not African, so we must be an American church, and it's always in contrast, which does feed the kind of concerns about the othering of certain people groups. Um, Charles, actually, really quick before I forget, you and I were recently at a meal together, and I think a spouse of one of the pastors highlighted a book, America, the multiple American federations in this continent. I'm actually almost done reading it. It's fascinating. I forget the name of the author, but kudos to that pastor and the pastor's spouse for sharing that book. But that really talks a lot about how the United States is largely, actually historically, according to this historian's argument, along ethno-cultural lines from the very beginning even to this day. So
And
I think
what's
it's
the name of it
insightful.
again? Enoch?
Oh, I totally don't remember. Americans. I have to open my Kindle app right here. But since you've cancel cultured me out. No, I'm just kidding. American Nations. American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America by a scholar, I think is a scholar named Colin Woodard. Not
Mm,
necessarily, I haven't finished the book, but it's really interesting. And I look forward to reading more different counterpoints on this, but helpful,
yeah.
interesting.
And so Ashley will pop that into the Facebook comments in case somebody's looking for that if she can find it. But that's good because I'd like to go back and read that too. I remember the dialogue around it,
Yeah.
and it's funny. This morning I was watching a documentary while I was working out, and it was talking about how if you go to any major war in the world, then this is going back to like 1400. They're talking about it. You'll find people from not that people as part of it, and he said typically it's the Scotch. There's something in the warrior culture of this that there, and that's very much the whole Scotch Irish military. They present a disproportionate number of our military are here, even right. So there's
Right,
something in
right.
the culture that generation after generation, it doesn't just go away, right?
No, I mean, again, I'm no scholar. I've just read a handful of books, but that comes up a big deal in this book, and the author makes a case to how it affects regional cultures and politics and our military.
Mm,
Fascinating. Again, I don't know enough to be a credible evaluator of it, but
yeah.
definitely interesting. Yeah, no.
And so, if you haven't picked up on it at this point, the topic we wanted to talk about today was an issue that relates to race. It's the whole anti-Asian racism and violence, and some of the Asian history, specifically Enoch, the Chinese American piece, which you may be closer to, but how it's evolved through the United States to understand the context because I've quoted James Baldwin a number of times, is that history is never gone. Just like you were just talking about, Enoch, is that stuff stays with us. It informs how we view the world. And so it's helpful to understand how others may view the world, that isn't our experience, but also understand how it's playing out in your community, in your congregation,
Hmm.
because there's been this spike in anti-Asian violence that may be a combination of more reporting of it, but that's so big, it seems that it's unlikely it's just that.
Mm.
And so maybe could you share a little bit about the history of ethnic Chinese people in the U.S. As much as I know you're not positioning yourself as an academic expert on it, but what you know through tradition, through your congregation, through your own history would be helpful.
Yeah, I probably would refer people to some books, and if you want, we could talk later. I can try to rustle up the names, but I think broadly speaking, popularly known, the ethnic Chinese have been here for a long time. Most famously as part of kind of the workers who came in. Basically, I think to displace other workers, either enslaved peoples or the other quote unquote undesirable workers, because I think Chinese were purportedly docile and hardworking and fit for the physical manual labor, especially some of the dangerous and most brutal work of the Continental Railroad. And if I talk about stuff that like, oh, these guys are fit for work and brutal and conditions, and that language probably is reminiscent of how other people have subjugated different folks. But then they've been throughout the whole time. There have been Chinese in the military for hundreds of years, and in this country, I guess also fairly well known, at least in New England where we live, which I think tends to think about these things a little bit more overtly. The Chinese Exclusion Act is probably one of the most famous uh, pieces of federal legislation that specifically target one ethnic group very specifically. In recent years, obviously, people have alleged and accused and made cases about how certain immigration programs or policies have discriminated or worked against certain Latino Americans, Latinx, or Africans, or Muslims, or Arabs and stuff. But I guess it's no one wants to win this contest, but the Chinese Exclusion Act is probably the explicit. Uh, it's not alone. There were other acts around that era as well, but so that's sort of the thing. I think if people have some sort of familiarity with a little bit of the African American enslaved experience on this continent, it's hard to obviously can't imagine growing up not being understanding that there's such a huge part of our country's history, for obviously not good reasons. But I think in terms of the Chinese and the Asians, that's actually been a big part of things too. You talk about violence um, and crime. There's definitely a higher reporting of this in our media. There is a higher incidence based upon, police reports. Hard to know if there's actually more incidents um, or if there are just more reporting of the incidents, and it's probably both. I have friends that would absolutely say, of course, there's more incidents. You have to blame the last presidential administration. I know people that would totally say that, but I'm not sure what data they're using. But I guess from that perspective, I think it totally makes sense to them how that works that way. For me, I I don't purport to have a good handle on the data, a good handle on the increased rise, but there's definitely always been there. And I do know that people in our communities, even in my church, and even here in Boston's Chinatown, there are people that, I talked to a principal of a local school in our community probably a couple months ago, they said there are literally families that have not left their home the entire pandemic,
Hmm.
the entire pandemic, and that is for fear of being attacked on the street.
Hmm.
It's a small number, I think, in Chinatown, in Boston, but there are definitely families. And in my own church, as we're relaunching in person services, that very sadly has come up, amidst masking, COVID protocols, and all those sorts of things, at risk populations to getting infected and hospitalizations. But also, like, it has come up of like security. Pastor Enoch, do we need more security? And I think, do you really think we're going to be needing security to the building? And then they said, well, maybe it'll make certain people feel better. So hard to know. I definitely feel like I think there's a lot of people who are younger who are very concerned for our seniors in our community.
Yeah.
How much the seniors feel that, I think, is probably going to be correlated to a lot of things, like what media outlets they're listening to and their circles, if they know someone that's had violence.
Hmm.
So that's kind of a thing right now. It's there, sadly. Um, I don't know how much, but it's definitely present. And I don't want to overstate it, but
Yeah.
even just a few people actually fearing for their physical safety. Of course, some people would say, welcome to my world. Some groups would say, we've always felt that way. And I can appreciate where they're coming from. But I would actually say some Asians have said they've always felt threatened. It's just that there are more threatening racial groups or something, or the model minority myth for Asian Americans acculturating so well. So,
Because it's easy to say as the observer, right? In the grand scheme of things, right? The incidence of attacks is so much smaller than the population. Your odds of being attacked are relatively low and all that. But the analogy I think about is, the week after a church shooting, right? I sit in church thinking about, okay, so what would we do? Right. And I think other people do that too. And so and now the odds of that happening are very, very remote too. And yet the thought is there. And when it's happening day after day, I think I can see where, the fear becomes, especially when you start thinking about your kids, or right, that the fear takes hold. And it's not unreasonable, even though the incident is small, because if it happens to you, it's not that, hey, well, the odds were low, right? So what are you going to do? It changes your life, your family's life, right, in ways that can never be undone. And
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I think it's an apt analogy. However, I think there's also a lot of other factors at play.
mhm,
There are many people in the community, Asian American Pacific Islander community, that also probably from their perspective thought this is our time and an opportunity to really highlight and spotlight the fact that there is discrimination beyond just the traditional black and white. You and I have talked about things for Vision New England, and I've tried to be charitable when I sit in racial conversations, and then at
you
the end
are.
I'll say, this was, I appreciate the dialogue here, but this was not really about race. And people said, what do you mean not about race? We totally talked about race. I said, we talked and I think had some frank conversations about black and white racial relations, but sometimes there's brother Sergio and others, from a Latin background. But there's many times where I'm the only non-white or black person there. And again, the narrative and the language we use to talk about race is largely indebted to African American studies, Chicano studies, and Asian American studies, which are historically liberation movements, which is why, we're going to go there. The critical race theory is grounded in those things when it comes to critical legal theory as well as Marxism, because that's sort of where some of those movements and liberation things came from. And we can do another podcast when we get Ray back if we want to talk about this critical race theory. That way, there's two bullseyes after that podcast. But I think, but I do think people wanted to capitalize on the opportunity to highlight the the issues that Asian Americans or Asians have been facing as well the entire time. And I think they did. As you know, I told you this also. Man, after some of those violent reportings, especially the tragedy of the victims in Atlanta, I realized I'm like the only Asian guy a lot of people know. And a lot of the only Asian pastor in a lot of the circles. And then I can imagine I think people can relate to being, it's just sort of like in Europe, maybe people are calling people in Germany or Belgium right now, hey, I know one Belgium, and there's a lot of horrific flooding there. So you just call that one person everyone knows. And so I definitely, for a moment, was getting a lot of those calls, and trying to be gracious and trying to field these genuine, concerned friends who are expressing condolences and concerns. But at the same time, that's definitely subsided. And I'm not upset about that subsiding, but I think it just comes into our natural cycle where, people move on to the next thing. And that's so in terms of dealing with race and violence, I think we need a more sustained conversation and effort and sustained relationships, right? If we only call each other when there's like big headlines, then we might be missing out on opportunities to really and grow to understand and helpful make some progress.
Yeah, because I think you'll correct me, I hope, but I was looking at the data, and the percentage of the population that is of the U.S. population that's Chinese. It's like, I think, 2%, if I remember right. It was a fairly low percentage. I didn't realize it was that low.
I don't actually carry those important stats around in my head, Charles. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I want to go back a little bit to the history. So it's something like that, but don't quote me on it, if that, just in case. And actually, I read it in Wikipedia, so I'm quoting the most unquotable source too.
The most
The
unquotable source that everyone reads, though, right?
in
So,
quotes.
yeah, in quotes, right?
And so if we go back, so there was, and actually, I'm just curious about your parents' immigration to Taiwan.
Mm.
You said that was a second wave. So was the first wave the 50s during the war, and then they came over after that, or did they come in the 50s and that was a second wave, or do you not know?
Uh, I'm getting the dates mixed up, but I think there are people that moved to the island of Taiwan in a previous wave,
Mhm.
pre-communist revolution. It probably was influenced. And again, I'm happily confess that I'm not a scholar, even though I took History 11A at UCLA my first year, which was 24 years ago or something now. But then there was a second wave. And I
Okay.
think the second wave, so when we speak of Taiwanese today or Formosan today, they're ethnically Chinese people,
Yeah.
unless you're speaking of the Aboriginal Taiwanese people, the what in actually in our church they call the mountain people, which I don't know if it's politically correct or not, but it's because they dwell in the mountains. And so that ethnicity is the same ethnicity as the latter wave, my parents. But I think there was a lot of strife. And even to this day, you can see in the rooted politics between Taiwan and China. Is Taiwan its own nation, or is it a proper part of the People's Republic of China and all that? That is a it's funny. People talk a lot about like the Middle East, rightly so, and a lot of people in this country have opinions about the West Bank and what people call Palestine, what I think people from Israel call Judea and Samaria. So even our calling it Palestine is sort of probably politically couched, whether we know it or not. But that stuff has been also that's Taiwan, that's Tibet, that's like
Yeah.
all these other countries, and it's just not reported on really here that much. But a lot of people in my church, they are up on what happens in the various movements in Hong Kong and Taiwan and the things that actually a lot of the political wonks, they actually talk a lot about China because China and Russia are the big political movers. And, there are a lot of things at tension with the United States of America. And there's a lot that the One Silk Road thing, I'm getting the English translation wrong, but there's a major campaign from CCP, the Communist Chinese Communist Party, to really build infrastructure throughout some of the African nations and things like that. And well, I'll let some people read and look that up later, but it's a pretty bold move by that country. So Taiwan, I think, as I understand it, wants to keep things the same. But my parents used to stress Taiwan is not a part of China. I know people at church today that would say, no, Taiwan's totally a part of China. So is Hong Kong. It's just, it's imagine any contention you might have about something like Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
That's happening over Taiwan and Hong Kong. And we actually have Tibetan Christians in our church. No
Because
one's
I'm
talking about Tibet anymore. So,
Yeah, yeah, no. The until the Nixon administration, right, we recognized Taiwan as China, and the mainland was rebellious provinces. And during the Nixon administration, we created this strategic ambiguity where we recognized the Communist People's Republic of China, Communist China, and left Taiwan in this ambiguous
yep.
state that implies that we sell them arms and we have good relations and all of those, and we kind of leave blank without saying there's two Chinas. We say there's
Yeah.
one China, but it's for a lot of diplomatic reasons we do that.
Yeah, I think it's a diplomatic tack. I think Taiwan has a non-voting seat at the UN. I think things like that, like the Palestinian Liberation did also, or in the few decades ago. So and I believe there's a lot of people that would want to maintain. I think the political term is maintain the status quo.
Yeah,
The strategic, defensive, political status quo. Anyway, but I don't know.
that's a
I'm
whole
totally not
political
qualified.
issue, right?
Yeah,
About
I'm totally
where
not.
that's going, which I
This is
also think is,
controversial stuff, but maybe the typical audience here doesn't even know
yeah,
where Taiwan is on a map. So
very concerning about what's going on there at this point, though.
it's a big
Um,
deal. Yeah.
the and then Americans really should be following and understanding because it has global implications, including America.
I think
The
so.
and so now there's as I read about the history, it seemed like there was. We'll leave Hawaii out because I think Hawaii has a very different ethnic Chinese history. But in the mainland U.S., there seems to go through periods where there's kind of low levels of Chinese immigration, and then suddenly there's spikes of Chinese immigration. To your point around the railroads, for example, the gold rush in California, I didn't realize was a huge draw to Chinese people,
Hmm. Hmm.
and then of course the gold rush turned into the gold bust, and now people are looking for jobs. The railroads become one, as well as working in jobs that had been held by slaves in the South. I hadn't realized there was an
Yep.
immigration that way, and so. They're instrumental in building the country at that point, but there is this issue that I think plays into some of our black-white issues in this country and other ethnicities where we've got these labor riots that play out as race riots, But it's that somebody new is coming in, right? The Irish are
Mm-hmm.
coming in, the blacks are coming in from the South, Chinese are coming in, and they're taking our jobs,
Mm-hmm.
and that turns into a riot with or violence with racial overtones, and then eventually plays into, I think, what you were talking about, which is the Exclusion Act, which severely limited um, immigration from China as well as the right to become a citizen even if you were here. Am I kind of capturing that accurately?
You know, that seems to be what a lot of people that I read say. Minor Feelings, Kathy Hong Park, and Erica Lee on uh, America for Americans, and they're in that narrative. Admittedly, those are from obviously very particular slants, and I think in general there's probably a consensus within ethnic studies, which was probably more progressive. Again, sort of a liberation mindset, not necessarily liberation theology, but like a liberation mindset. And so a lot of it is some would call it xenophobia, because you can fan the flames of fear, which would lead to action and anger and maybe even hatred and policy. And so I think, there were times Chinese were hired to displace the blacks because they couldn't technically enslave them in that same way, with sharecropping and all these other systems that were come up, and Jim Crow laws. But also, I think if I remember correctly, there were times when it was Irish. People didn't want to hire the Irish, so they hired Chinese. They imported Chinese people, and I think, just like I think the Irish were actually hired to do other things too. So I think there's just generally a narrative there of people who had political or economic muscle bringing in cheap labor, and these are almost always places that were coming from struggling places, which is why they're willing to do brutal labor. Like I think the railroad, I don't know, I envision a cartoon of people like putting down tracks on the smooth plain, but it's like blasting holes through the sides of mountains. It's like treacherous work. It's in exposure and incredibly hot or frigid environments. It's dangerous stuff, and not to
Yeah.
mention the heavy stuff, they're moving machinery. And actually, in Chinatown during the pandemic, we actually listened to a descendant of someone whose ancestor was one of those people, and they actually had a picture. It's pretty cool, and there's some really great Asian American resources and studies and histories here in UMass Boston and other places. But yeah, it helped me get a sense of how brutal railroad construction work back then was, and really, it was historically, I believe, many of the toughest things, the most brutal jobs, were done by the Chinese, as
Yeah.
I understand it. I'm sure others did it as well, but that's just what I've read.
Yeah, it's the same thing. I had the same experience learning more about the Panama Canal, right? Where it's
Mm,
just like, okay, I've been to the Panama Canal, right? And it's like it's relatively smooth, right? It goes up, there's locks, it's interesting. And then you read about the building of it, the thousands and thousands of people who died building
mm.
the canal, either from construction safety issues or just disease and
Yep. It's why
dysentery.
we don't do those anymore. It's why we can't build pyramids today because it's the slave labor that was used, and so yeah, it's yeah, and I think you're right.
But the dynamic you just spoke about seems to me very similar to the dynamic we have today with immigration.
Hmm.
Is there is, without getting too political about it, but there is a group who we like the cheap labor,
Yep.
right? They're willing to do jobs cheaper than people who might be here. And so the word for that is exploit. And I'm no Marxist, so don't hear me that way. But it's exploitative. We just want somebody we can pay less to get value. Now we all benefit from that system because that means cheaper products for everybody. And so I think as Christians, there's a little bit of a challenge there of where people are coming here voluntarily. We'll leave out the illegal legal question for now, but they're coming here voluntarily, seeking out a better life. But there's a piece of it that we just want the cheap labor. And it sounds, you just kind of mirror the same thing. And then there's other people here who we don't want this immigration coming in because they're cheap labor and they reduce the wage rate of people who are here. It sounds to me like it's no different than what you're talking about. Am I oversimplifying it?
So this is Enoch, me
Yeah.
personally. I just want to be very mindful of the word exploit,
Mhm.
because I do think it can be very, very it can be quite evocative, though I think obviously there's pieces of that. But I think the principle is, it seems to me, again, not as an economist or anyone, just some guy that reads and tries to stay abreast and has a church that listens to their stories. Yeah, there's definitely market forces. We want cheaper goods and products. We want cheaper services. We want cheaper medical care. Well, one of the ways you do that is you have to change the way the business of medicine is delivered. So one of those things, for example, anesthesiology. Like I'm told now by my anesthesiologist friends that those are the medical doctors that give the anesthetics for surgeries and procedures and stuff. They used to have like a bunch more in the hospitals. Now there's just one that walks the floor. The rest are nurse practitioners, highly trained people, but not MD. And I think going forward, they might not even need that. So that sounds good for everyone else, unless you're an anesthesiologist or something, right? So same with like goods and produce. Like it's so much cheaper. That sounds good unless you're in those parts of the country that is just taking up all the water for the agriculture, which again, I don't know enough to say that's good or bad policy, but people love the fact they got this great deal on clothes, this great deal at a retail store, disposable fashion, as it is now said. It's so fast from concept to design to market to being on the racks in the United States in stores. And yet right then they complain about paying for it, or they say, oh, we need to do better at the factories and stuff. So for example, the exploitation, the reason why some of that exploitation quote unquote works is because they're coming from worse conditions.
Yeah.
Now as Christians, if we know they're coming from worse conditions and we're paying them less than others simply because we can do that and they don't have the political will to back off or to push back, then yeah, that's probably bordering on basically taking advantage of the poor rather than serving them. And that, I think, therefore, the golden rule, do unto others what you would have them do unto you, kind of comes into case. But there are many populations in troubled places. That's why that book, When Helping Hurts, put another book for Ashley to find. There's a lot of incentivizing for certain poorer nations to just continue to getting money from richer European or American nations. They don't mind it, even though these activists are saying, we're actually not helping lift up and empower them in the best way, and so we're just perpetuating a sense of dependence. And I found that book very helpful, and I think about it all the time for things like global missions, or actually just as a larger church in the area. There's probably ways we are being quite patronizing and condescending to smaller churches. I just think that's any large organization. It's easy as a large church to think you don't need or you can't learn from. And I want to publicly repent and confess I don't think that's the spirit of Christ. I think we have a lot to learn. Larger does not equal more blessed or more biblical at all. But yeah, so I do think this whole idea of displacement and work is an issue. And we talked about the immigration one, the podcast we did. What's the problem if our country needs more software engineers? Bring them in. Our country needs more nurses or home healthcare workers. Bring them in. And the point I made, having done some global missions and talking to people in those countries, is the brain drain on those countries.
Yeah.
Those individuals want to get a better life, and they've got the skills to come to the United States or other places and get it. But you're just taking the brightest and most educated of that country. I don't know. That doesn't. I think as Christians, we have to think about that as well.
And I
Everyone's
don't,
happy, yeah, but I just don't know if that's the most honoring way.
yeah, I don't know the solution. I agree with you. I don't know the solution to it though, because it doesn't feel good, at least, to say, no, we're going to leave them there, right? In poverty. Haiti is a place where I've done some work over the years, and there's huge brain drain problems there. If you're talented and can get out, you get out.
Yeah.
And but I don't know that it solves anything by saying, no, I'm going to force you to, I'm not going to
Yeah.
let you out,
I'm
right?
also not telling they shouldn't have the opportunities to come in. I'm also not saying they should feel guilty. I
Yeah.
would probably be in the same. I just think as Christians, um, what did we talk about? Second and third order consequences and things like that. I just think right, a Christian is supposed to be burdened with issues that don't directly affect her or him. That's
Yeah.
what it means to love our neighbor, and we have to spend time wading into the weeds and the difficult topics because love and the gospel compels us, and also because we actually don't just care for their bodies, we actually care for their souls. We want to share the hope. And again, so we're getting into normal territory about that.
Say that again, though. I love that quote. I don't know if I can't say it word for word, but you said we need to be burdened by the things that don't directly impact us.
Oh yeah, I think we need to be burdened by things that don't directly affect us.
And say more about that, please.
Um, so okay, this gets a very, very personal.
Okay.
I think whenever we talk about any social political issue, right? If you're not really aware of it, you hear about it on some report, unless something happened on the news and that's why we report about it. But whether it's animal protection rights or redoing the healthcare system, anyone who's kind of there, or in race and systemic arguments about systemic or structural injustice, all those things, or even for Asians. There's a clothing brand company in the late 90s and early 2000s that came out with some T-shirts, graphic tees, and they had some phrases that I think a lot of my friends would call racist. Uh, Shirts like laundromat, like people with sort of stereotypical pictorialized like Asians, with the slanty eyes, and it was a laundromat T-shirt, graphic tee. It said two Wongs make a white, because Wong is a very common Asian Chinese surname. And I had a lot of friends who were coming from Asian American studies that were really upset and offended by that. And so I remember struggling and thinking, okay, you're making this about racism and morality, but most of the people I know think it's not that big a deal. And I struggled and wrestled and I prayed and said, God, should I be, should I care about this issue, right? And one of my friend's words to this day, her words, don't haunt me, but they echo. She said this about, I am so frustrated by people, particularly in this case, other Asian Americans who were not as active or engaged. She said that enjoy the benefits of some of the rights and progress that has been made by people who've really fought for these things and don't even acknowledge that it's because the people that fought for them are those that they think are extreme. She was basically saying it's because you enjoy certain privileges and rights as a citizen or just as a resident of this country that other people have fought over. The people you call like extreme, their extremeness has moved the needle forward in certain respects. Okay, so then I said, okay, then I realized over time, whether it's about Black Lives Matter or about voting or anything, that, and especially in my world of Asian Americans, the people that really want to address things, I would say they're quite angry. There's a lot of anger. And I think as I've listened and tried to understand the anger, I think the anger comes from hurt. Some people would call trauma, but basically very negative experiences. So some of the, I'm not here to rehash um, old issues, but certain publishing companies in the evangelical subculture have, if you were to Google like Asian racist in like Vacation Bible School curriculum or some well-known churches, these things are there and it brings up all this hurt. Now I remember thinking the people that were so adamant against those things, when I spoke to them and listened to them, they had experienced racism as children. And so these things were bringing those memories back. Okay, so then I go, okay, God, I'm praying, should I be actually more moved to action by this? Maybe something's wrong with me. Maybe if I had more empathy, I would actually realize that actually I should be doing more. And so then at some point I thought, well, no, I guess if you're moved to action, maybe those people are, to use a Christian term, called to that issue, because we all have the issues that we call to. We can't all deal with every single issue. And so I thought maybe that's their calling. But as I've gotten older and thought about this, I've also learned this, that the people, if the only people bringing up an issue are traumatized or hurt and predominantly seem, not all, but seem to radiate anger, I have found that that anger tends to repel someone who's not affected by that. So you get this sort of catch-22 chicken and the egg thing. The people that are most aware or at least directly experience the negative impacts of this reality, call it a policy, call it a mindset, call it a culture, call it a practice, are the most active, are angry, and that anger emanates and radiates from them. And the people that could, the middle majority, the mushy middle, right, if you will, they just feel the anger and we get defensive. We go, oh man, you're really worked up about this, and we push back. Today, Charles, I think that as a preacher of the gospel or just someone that's trying to see the Lord do the work, I think it's not about rallying those who are angry or hurt, though that has its place. That's called Twitter. You say it, you can tweet something and rally the people that are already there and angry, and I think there's a value in place for that. But I feel my personal calling is, I used to think, okay, because I'm not angry or personally affected, maybe I'm not called to do that because I can't understand it. But today, I'm sort of thinking, no, I don't get to be off the hook because I didn't get to experience negative consequences directly. I'm Asian and I'm a minority. I grew up in Southern California. I knew that technically I was a minority, but I was not a minority experience growing up in my school, where all my honors classes was almost all Asians except for two white kids, and they were always Jewish. And we had very few Latina people, very few blacks in that community. And so, which is very different than the community I raised my children in here in Medford, Massachusetts, and just what I see here in New England. So my basic view today is, no, if I am not hurt or traumatized or angry about it, I don't get to have a pass on these issues. I think I'm called to listen to them. And again, you still can't address every issue, But I actually think it's people who haven't been directly hurt. We have an advantage, which is we can learn from the painful experiences of others and then move forward and explain it in a way that maybe translates to someone who's never had some of those negative experiences and help everyone in the healing process. So I think Christianity or any sort of social movement or advancement is engaging those that are not directly affected to care about the issue without traumatizing them, like, without tapping into or shaming them into it. All those are valid tactics.
Yeah.
They have their place, I suppose. But I think if the answer is, well, it doesn't affect me, then I'm only gonna politically engage if it affects me. I think Christians have to operate. I'm not sure that's the main filter for us. Does it
Mhm.
affect me? If it does, then I'll engage. If it doesn't, then I think Christians have to care about neighbors, even if those neighbors' issues don't directly affect us. And I think that's your intro every time, right? When the church is acting like the church, that opens the way for why do you care about this issue when you are not affected by it? You haven't been hurt by it. You don't personally gain by it
Yeah.
because God created and loves all these people, and He's pleased because His righteousness and justice are the foundations of His throne. But also, on those foundations, He wants to preach the saving message of Jesus. So that's where I'm kind of thinking personally. I hope your listeners are not sleeping, but that's basically one of my basic views on why I pick and engage in issues.
I think it's great because I think we Christians are good at doing exactly what you just said when the issue is abortion, and I think we're good at it when it's hunger. And I think the church is on the forefront of human trafficking in that way. But I do think there's a reluctance by most, I would say, white Christians to step into the race dialogue um, in a listening mode. And I don't know if it's because it's been so politicized and is used as a weapon in some cases, or if it's apathy or something else. But I think your point is so good. If we leave all of the solutioning to the people who are most hurt and most angry, that doesn't always lend yourself to good solutions. And the church needs to wade into that in a way to love people, to help people heal, but to engage in the dialogue to come up with what actually could be useful solutions. Would you agree?
I would agree, but I don't think you said it or intended it, but I want to make it clear for our audience that, we're not implying that because you've been hurt or traumatized, you're not in a good position to propose the
Yeah.
best solutions. I actually think they're probably better equipped to do those, but I guess the secular political term is allies.
Yeah.
I, I see value in that, and it does feel like a battle. But I guess what I would say is, yeah, we're all called to care, but we can't. So for local church trying to figure out what to deal with,
Yeah.
I think it's all the things that the local leadership does. They pray, they read scripture, they study, they listen. But I think there's another thing, couple things quick playing out about, like, you mentioned a few things that Christians seem to be okay doing or white evangelicals can do, but maybe not so much, like hunger and things. Two quick things. One would be sort of how certain political issues fell into certain political parties and things. So I think the pro-life, pro-choice issue is a classic example. I can't remember the books, but I remember reading some interesting books and how I think I'm pro-life, and don't quote me, but I'm about to go on the internet forever to say this. But I remember reading something along the lines where it's interesting that had the civil rights movement gone a little differently, pro-life would have been the the platform of the Progressive Democratic Party.
Hmm.
If you extend civil rights, we went to, whether it's non-whites, whether it's women, right? I would even say civil rights to LGBTQIA. I don't think anyone would say they don't deserve civil rights, like the ability to, not be afraid for their physical well-being and other things, of course. And then we sort of go to animals, animals' rights. I think it's a combination. I'm no historian about this, but I remember also reading about how Christians realized that among all the issues, if they kind of went pro-life, they could actually get a lot of people. And then you've got the machine where a lot of evangelicals get in there. And I think younger evangelicals today realize, hey, you care about pro-life, and I understand that's good, but you don't seem to be as passionate about the poor or as passionate about other issues of morality or systemic justice. So I think that happened there. But there's another distinction that I would go way back to John Stott, some early books he wrote probably in the 70s or 80s, which I found helpful. And now we're getting to United States Christian history about how Christians conservatively, the Christians that were more engaged with social action ended up being the mainline denominations. And then we have the fundamentals of the faith where we landed on evangelicalism. And now we've got fundamentalism. So basically, there's definitely, historians and Mark Knoll, among others, where I think, we really did as an evangelical Christian movement sort of say, let's keep scripture and let's keep the gospel, and anything that smells of social action is not gospel or compromise. And I think, in recent years, whether it's the hole in the gospel or just a lot of Christians realizing we probably have to correct things. But there's one more thing that I found super helpful: the distinction between relief and development. It's politically easy today to give food to hungry people. But when you attempt to, and it's also easy to give, but I mean politically easy, like it's easy to train them for jobs.
Yeah.
But once you shift from relief to development and then advocacy, it's tricky. So now we're talking, hey, why are these people hungry? Maybe because they don't have jobs. Why they don't have jobs? Maybe it's because of the educational system. Now we need to, in order to address hunger, we should advocate for certain policies in education. Now it's crossing some sort of line that is sacred to people. And I think there is a legitimate difference there. But now that line, rather than have a food pantry, advocate for fair living wage. It actually still could be motivated by addressing the issues of hunger. One is on a systemic level, one is more upstream, if you will. One is actually proactive, preventative. One is very arguably reactive, because you could do a food pantry forever, but if that's all you do, I could see why that, doesn't really do much, right? The analogy is there's a river, it's got pollution in it, and people are getting sick. Well, we can give them medicine. No one will argue with giving them medicine. But then as people look, the reason why they're sick is because of the water. Well, why is the water bad? We go up, oh, because there's this factory over there. Well, this factory is producing things, and they're really rich and powerful, and they actually produce things that most of the rest of the world wants. We want those goods, but that water is poisoning the people downstream. So now we go advocate for environmental laws, and now we're wading in politics. And I think that, a couple things. One, it's just harder to make a case for.
Yeah.
Two, it looks like you're doing it for yourself. You could accuse someone of, you're collecting political power. Whereas if you're giving away food, you're really not obviously benefiting yourself. I suppose you could make an argument that you're getting political power, but also it becomes very, I think, harder. It's a lot more complicated. Giving
Well,
food to a starving person is totally
yeah.
simpler compared to what policies do we need to make to establish fair wages. And yeah, so
And we've kind of gotten off topic, and I hope that's okay. But I'm enjoying the conversation anyway. But this kind of relates back to our topic a little bit,
yes,
because I think you've just hit on something. Because it seems to me that when it comes to education, there is a movement to eliminate tests, standardized testing, and to use quotas, but under different names, right? To deal with the fact that we really just won't fix our educational system. And so some people, there are poor schools in the country. They're not only, and there's good schools in urban areas, there's bad schools in urban areas. Disproportionately, they're going to be bad. The poor schools in urban areas, that disproportionately impacts immigrants, African Americans, Latino, and crime plays a role in that too. And instead of solving that, we'll just do away with tests and admit people based on numbers. Is that an oversimplification of what's going on? Because I know there's a case in Boston that relates
yeah,
specifically
it's
to
a
that.
huge case, and we both have friends that have places of voice and responsibility in that system of how
Right.
they decided this past year to
And
co-opt.
on both sides, who would, right? Very good friends who we respect, so we know they're good,
Yes,
well-meaning people, but
yes.
would see the issue differently.
Yeah, and so let me do a couple things that'll be on the issue of Asian, anti-Asian discrimination and violence, but just basically offend everyone else who's still listening. Um, we were on a call in Chinatown after the violence. Actually, it was a Massachusetts-wide call for Asian Americans. Um, and we talked about how all this violence and everything, and the uptick in violence in major cities reported like New York and San Francisco. One person of an older generation was the only one that came close to saying, I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of the violence on Asians is actually perpetuated by one racial group, by blacks. And I know my friends who are probably not of that same generation, they were not happy with that. And the reason why is because, first of all, we all have a common enemy in their minds. The common enemy is white supremacy and structural racism. So don't divide people. And that's why the Asian Americans who are suing places like Harvard or suing places like the city of Boston Education is, the narrative would be don't make minorities and people of color fight each other, need solidarity. And so they're actually saying, okay, the reason why those Asians are voting or suing for Harvard or other places, it's because they're really controlled by white supremacists. And the fact of the matter is, there's a lot of there's incentives for certain institutions or people groups to probably preserve the status quo. But there are, honest to God, a lot of Asians, and I'm going to offend a lot of my progressive friends here, that really are affected. And you can look at the Boston schools. Black and Latino might go up, but Asians will absolutely go down. And arguably, the Asians that go down don't have certain options like certain wealthier white families that could then still choose for other options like a parochial school or a private school. The Asians in a lot of these places, they don't have the option to leave that system. So it's really complicated. It's really difficult. And this is, I believe, an area where Asians do have different views a lot of times. Again, it's not monolithic,
Yeah.
but this is that discrimination. That is a very complicated, super emotional topic right now, especially in Boston.
It's certainly not unreasonable for our African American friends to point to, hey, look, we've been seriously disadvantaged, and the whole point of, without endorsing or criticizing affirmative action, the whole point of affirmative action is to try and deal with that. But then the implications is somebody loses in that zero-sum game. And it seems to be, based on the data, Asian Americans disproportionately. And it's hard then, I would think, for an Asian American to say, okay, my child will be disadvantaged because of what white people did to Black people in our history, and in some cases more recent, obviously. And so is that how people in your circle would look at the issue, or would they come at it a little differently?
I would say that's definitely one robust narrative.
Okay.
But it doesn't get vocalized because a couple reasons. One, they're afraid of violence or political reprisal. Number two, I'm going to get also in trouble here. If you read New England news, almost every act reported of racism, and I'm not a scholar, that I remember, always mentions the last president and their policies, almost without exception. All the things that Asian, and they would trace it to the anti-Asian words, particularly, certain ways that the coronavirus was described, and they would almost exclusion. But if it was a Black on Asian incident, they would at most maybe mention that this person had a criminal record. And I think I understand the media is trying to not add, fuel to the fire. I think they're trying to be objective in their sense, but I feel that objectivity is probably indicating certain political views, which they can make known in the editorial. So I would say what you described is present. Whether I don't know if it's the majority. I don't know that there is a majority. And I also think Asian culture, it's just not likely to make a big verbal stink and fuss about it. So you have all those reasons that they may not be reported on, it may not be spoken up about, but it's very divisive right now. It's pretty hard.
Without impugning the entire journalistic profession.
Yes.
And so I will say there are exceptions on both sides, but I think most of what passes for objectivity is only objective if you agreed with me from the start.
You're brave. I don't know if I'd say that, but yeah. Okay, yeah.
We talked before. There's a fine line between brave and foolish, and I cross it more often than most people.
Brave, foolish, arrogant, or just ignorant and just
reckless,
jumping on landmines that we don't even know are landmines. We just think it's funny. So, but no, I do think it's important because they're trying to, right? The purpose of this series, I think, as long as you'll have me and Ray, is trying to. I'm passionate about nuance, which is kind of a strange thing. Trying to really understand the perspectives of different people before we decide for certain. Of course, you can't learn enough to really know everything before you decide. Just like we tell preachers, you can't nail down every single interpretation of every passage before you have to preach a sermon. There's always going to be more commentaries to read. You just have to do the best with the time and the information you have. And so I think same with these issues.
But I think you're one of the best people I know on this. But then we should approach it with a spirit of humility and a willingness to say, maybe I'm wrong about that. And I think
Well,
you're amazing on that because you know so much, and
well,
you're right, but you'll always come at it from a position of
that's
humility.
very nice of you to say, but if you've been wrong as many times as I have, it's just a natural consequence of just like doing that. When you've had to say sorry and realize that what you didn't mean to come off as rude or arrogant or insensitive, it's yeah. I'm not wise. I've just probably messed up and hurt a lot of people over my time, more than my share. So that's
Well,
very gracious of you.
I think that's you being humble again, because I've been wrong more than you. And if you don't believe me, I'll get my wife in here right now. She'll tell you.
Well, we don't need to win this contest. We're both recipients of God's grace and favor. But yeah.
Amen. And so we're a little bit over time, but I want to give you the last word. What have I not asked you about, or talked about, or thought about, or said wrong that you think it would be helpful to correct or speak to?
I don't think anything you said is wrong and correct, and there's probably so much more. But the one thought that came to my mind is probably not super important among everything else. But let's talk about diversity, and
Mm,
especially in the evangelical subculture. We need diversity. Diversity typically in an Asian church means unity in a translated service, like 2 or 3 languages. But it seems to me in the evangelical white subculture, diversity means non-white people going to a white church, or white and blacks having visits to each other churches. It seems very disingenuous or ignorant or something to tout diversity and actually never consider having white people join Latin led churches,
mm,
join Arabic churches, even visit um, Asian churches.
mm,
I don't know why people have to plant a new church. When you want diversity, don't plant a church. You could, if God's called, just go to one of those churches. And
mm,
then I think there is a gross gross underestimation of the cultural differences. What a lot of people, I heard this yesterday. I won't mention the church. That church has 40 or 50 nations in their church. There's a difference between having people from those nations in your church versus they have actually amalgamated into a distinct culture of multiple cultures.
mm,
Most of the time I find in these churches, and I'm not saying this to criticize them, just to be descriptive at this point, is it's still the majority dominant culture, but there's code switching, which is to say people from other cultures know how to behave. I know how to keep my shoes on when I walk into a white person's home. It goes against everything. I feel like I'm sinning when my shoes are on their carpet, or even most. I sit on their bed or their couch and I'm just sitting because that's what they do. It feels wrong, but I can do it. But I know Asians that will, I'm sorry, Charles, if you can I please take off my shoes? That feels so wrong. So I'm pretty used to our functioning, but I guess I would ask if the 5 people listening with, my family, my mother and your family or whatever, I think this idea of diversity is the average monocultural person is probably going to have a hard, that sounds so elitist what I'm about to say. I think diversity is a lot deeper and harder than most people think. And
yeah, yeah.
that's I just want to put it out there.
It's a great point, to get more than superficial diversity, right, and get real community.
Well,
Um,
I would say the thing is, even superficial community diversity is really hard. So to a
mhm,
monocultural person, you can't tell me it's superficial because it was hard to get here. I have
yeah,
no doubt. But there's
yeah,
so much more to go. And yeah. So anyway, but I appreciate
yeah.
you and the work, and I appreciate learning from so many people in Vision New England and Vision and the churches here. It's wonderful to be in New England and Boston.
Yeah, I think, and you don't have to buy into any of the narratives out there to recognize. And I think this has been so helpful with some of our African American board members who've been so gracious with me in pointing it out. Is you invite me into a white thing, and white people in Vision New England, we don't think of Vision New England as a white thing. We just think of it as a thing, but it's because we do it the way we do everything, which we also don't think of as kind of a corporate thing, but it's heavily influenced by business people, right? So it does have that corporate flavor, and we don't necessarily realize that or think about it all the time, that we're not changing it to make it really something we can all be part of and feel like it's our thing, not a white thing or a black thing or a Chinese thing or whatever, Latino thing,
Yeah.
what have you. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a great point. Thank you for making that. I think that might be a good conversation for a future podcast, even. And so, Enoch, thank you so much, brother. I just appreciate you so much. I appreciate your ministry. I appreciate what the partnership we have, and so I'm really grateful to you. And to our audience, I would say thank you for being with us again. I hope you learned some stuff from Enoch that I did. And I always just think, let's just pray about what God wants us to do with what we heard. What does God want me personally to do with what I heard? And I'd like to thank our producer, Ashley Pitkin, for putting this together. If you're blessed by it, please like us, share it, follow us. We're on Facebook, YouTube, Apple, Amazon, Google, and Spotify. And you can always find more information at visionnewengland.org. Our next episode, we'll have a guest host, Heidi Joy from Breathe Ministry. Breathe does pastoral soul care and retreats for pastoral couples. She'll be talking to Ruth Calver. Ruth led a ministry in the UK called Living with Leadership. And the topic they'll be discussing is being the spouse of a pastor and what does that look like? Ruth also is married to Clive Calver, who they both came here to lead World Relief. And then they were my pastors actually in Connecticut, but they both pastored in Connecticut. And Ruth always has wonderful things to say. I think you'll be blessed by it. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.